All right, welcome everyone. My name is Joanna Bird, Executive Director with NASW-PA. Welcome to the final day of the Lead Up to Lead webinar series. Want to introduce our president, Sarah McNeil. Sarah, welcome. Glad you're with us.
Yes, glad to be here today. Excited to talk about macro social work as a macro practitioner myself. So thank you all for attending today.
All right. Um, well, I'm not sure if there's anyone else here that we need to introduce. There is, okay.
Yes, so I did ask Christine, leader, and is it leader? I always
Letterer.
letter. Oh, I knew it. 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 But yes, I did ask Christine to talk a little bit about her position. She has a very interesting position that I think a lot of social workers would like to hear about as well. That also involves macro social work and advocacy. And so I did ask her to come and speak today.
Great. All right. Well, Christine, welcome and glad to have you with us as well.
Thank you.
Um, President McNeil, do you want to kick us off?
All right. So I did want to start this session a little bit different. In my head, I had this whole sort of idea plan, and then I had a meeting just before this where I was speaking with students and they were talking about sort of their own feelings of where they are right now. And so I did want to just take a few minutes in the beginning just to sort of hold space for you all, and sort of talk about and acknowledge what we are feeling right now as social workers. And so I'll start, but so a few weeks ago in my own social work journey, I will say I was feeling not as passionate. And for those of you that knows me, I'm a very passionate person, especially when it comes to social work. I give, 110% to any initiatives and programs that I'm working on. And I will say I sort of lost that. And a lot of people are like, oh, you're experiencing burnout. And I was like, oh, no, no, no. I know what burnout feels like. And this is not a burnt out feeling because I still enjoyed being a social worker. I still enjoyed doing all my work. But it was this feeling of sort of being defeated. It was this feeling of feeling like that the world is attacking me, not only just as a professional, as a social worker, but also just as an individual, where I see some of these EOs coming out. I'm like, it's a challenging time. And then to be in meetings where I have worked really hard to get them to acknowledge racial justice, and that's part of the name, and now I have to change it to something, and like I think like community justice, and to see that word being removed, I think sometimes we think that language and words are just that. It means, I'm so sorry, my phone's gonna keep ringing. I apologize. Let me put this on silent. And so that feeling of seeing racial justice switch to community justice did something to me where I was not expecting that reaction. And so I'm someone that's also very introspective. And so I'm constantly looking at sort of my internal piece. What am I feeling right now? What does this mean? And then I'm also someone that looks at external. So, like, if I'm feeling this, are other social workers feeling this? Are other individuals feeling this? And so what I realized is that no one's taken the time to acknowledge this. No one's taken the time to acknowledge what does it mean to be a social worker where we're rooted in social justice, we're rooted in community organizing. We have advocacy at every single level to feel like what we're doing is not working. And that was a huge hit to me. Like I said, as someone who's very passionate about both in both my personal and professional life, to feel like what I'm doing is not working was a challenge. And so I was like, okay, what does this mean? Because I didn't want to stay in this position. And I want you all to feel and sort of listen that you do not have to stay in this position. And so this made me think about actually something that prompted this was a meme, right? Social media is good for some things. So there was a meme that came up that said something about like a choir and how a choir's ability to hold a note is that, you take turns breathing. And I was like, that's it. That's exactly what we need to do right now. Is that we feel like advocacy right now is this huge grand gesture that we all have to, get out on the streets and, protest, and that we have to write these letters, we have to do all these. And yes, we do have to do that, but you don't have to take it all on yourself. Part of being a social worker is that we are a community profession. We lean on each other. We understand the importance of collaboration. And so now we need to take that same mindset and put that into advocacy. And we need to breathe. I want you to take a deep breath in and take that deep breath out. And that is your first form of resistance. Breathing is your first form of resistance because it builds hope. So, what does this look like in terms of advocacy? So you don't always have to do everything, right? So there's going to be different opportunities for us throughout the year that we have worked on a chapter to that we're going to be putting out that you can take 10, 15 minutes and do one of those things, and that has such a large impact on the work that we're doing. So I know it feels like we have to address everything at one time. I know it feels like that everything is coming down and everything is crashing, and we don't know sort of what the next thing to do. And so what I'm asking you all to do is one, lean on to other social workers, leaning on people who are like-minded, who understand you without having you to go and do that extra explanation is going to be so helpful. That's what I have been doing up until this point. Having those moments of sharing spaces with social workers, talking about what we're feeling, what we're experiencing, and how we can move forward from this. That's one form of advocacy, and that's also one form of resistance. The other thing is look at what advocacy opportunities are out there and are available, and how you can take 15 to a half an hour of your time and participate in one of those advocacy sessions. You do not have to do everything. We're just asking you to commit maybe 15 or 30 minutes to one of these, and then and then that's sort of what your advocacy sort of looks like. So I don't want to take up too much time, but I did sort of want to just get that message out. And I apologize if it's not 100% clear. Like I said, I just got off a meeting 2 minutes before this and decided to change everything up last minute. But I hope that does resonate with some of you that, one, let's normalize these feelings. Let's normalize that we are feeling attacked on a professional and personal level. Let's normalize that we all are taking all this in and we're holding it, whether it's in your back, your chest, your heart, wherever it is. And that I just want you to take that deep breath, reevaluate, be present, and sort of figure out how you want to show up and what that time looks like moving forward. And so thank you.
Thank you so much, President McNeil. That was wonderful. So as we're talking about macro social work, President, can you explain a little bit about what you do in your day job?
Yeah. Before I always like to give this little it's not a trigger warning, but this I can't think of words right now. It is Friday. I had a very long week. But I always like to give this sort of intro of like, yes, I am a macro practitioner, but when I enter rooms, I don't say I'm a macro practitioner. I say I'm a social worker because we are a multifaceted profession. And so sometimes I think we do ourselves a disservice when we say that, oh, I'm a clinical or social worker and I'm a macro social worker, because at the end of the day, we need each other to sort of advocate on all levels, right? We need the work that you're doing at direct practice, but we also need the work that some of us are doing at the macro level. And so I always say that just I'm a social worker, but yes, my work is in macro practice. And so so my day job is Director of Workforce Development in Philadelphia Connections. Very long title to just explain that the first half of my title, which is Director of Workforce Development, I am based in Philadelphia, and so I am in charge, not in charge, but my responsibilities are to understand the workforce challenges that early career professionals and students who are on a licensure path are facing, and then create solutions. So believe it or not, both my roles as president and director overlap a lot because my day job, I do work with social workers mostly. However, I do have to understand PCs, marriage family therapists, psychiatrists, and nurses because it's the entire behavioral health system. And so my job is to understand these challenges. So I do a lot of data collection. I do some focus groups and listening sessions. So that way I can get a better grasp of what everyone is facing. And then I turn that into programming. And so Philadelphia Connections is our training arm. And so one of our longest standing training programs is something called Enhanced Placement, where we train third year BS or fourth year BSW students and then all master level students on different components of behavioral health. And the reason why this program was started is because family members actually, and if we ever want to get into that conversation, I'd love to talk about how family members are a huge part of advocacy and how we should learn, how we should figure out how we can partner with family members to really advocate for some of the things, the bills that we are addressing. So, sorry, not to go into that rant. So family members were recognizing that students were graduating with missing some of the core parts of what it means to work in the behavioral health system. And so that's where this program was started. So there's 10 different seminars that students can come and take. If you are based in Philly, I would say please look into this because we also offer a small stipend. So if you are a fourth year BSW student, you receive $300. And if you are a master's level student, you receive $500. So I always tell students, where else are you going to get paid to learn? And then we also feed you very well. So I'm someone that operates under the idea that if you are coming and taking a training or spending your time with me, I'm going to make sure that you are well fed. And so we make sure to have great catering for you all. The other part of my job is again talking to elected officials, awareness. Again, I'm not allowed to lobby in my day job, so anytime I'm reading with elected officials, it's under the guise of education and awareness. I'm also a grant writer, project manager, and a program developer. So I love my job because every day looks different, but I also get to make the most impact because if I can help create a competent workforce, then that has a direct impact on the families and the communities that we serve. I'm also a fellow learning more about how to build equity grounded systems. And so completing that capstone, that will be ending in August. I can't believe it's already been a year already, but that fellowship will be finishing up. But yeah, that's a little bit about what I do on a daily basis.
Okay, thank you. And Christine, I wanted if you could talk a little bit about your position.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm with NAMI Keystone, and NAMI, for those who don't know, is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. We're the largest grassroots mental health organization in the country, and we operate on a local, state, and national level. So it's three-tiered. And I'm currently with the state NAMI. So I'm actually in a brand new position, which is kind of interesting. So I really get to mold it to what I think would be good for the bigger picture and also what I'm interested in as a macro social worker. So my official title is Affiliate Relations Director. And the majority of my work is with all of our local affiliates. So we have about, I want to say about 15 spread out throughout Pennsylvania. So as a macro social worker, that was really appealing to me because I'm getting the opportunity to work with people across the state, and they're all working with extremely different resources and demographics and communities. And it ranges from people who are working in extremely rural communities whose main push is just to get people to attend their programming to Anami Philly, who doesn't really have the problem with attendance, but is trying to get to all the different parts of the city and partner with a lot of organizations that may be doing similar work or aligning work. So they just have an extremely different trajectory than someone who's maybe in a rural part of central Pennsylvania. So that was what was appealing about the job to me, that I worked at NAMI Chester last year as a social work intern. And I really love NAMI's mission because all of our services are free. We offer support groups, advocacy, and really any sort of resources that people struggling with mental illness or mental health conditions would need. And so I already believed in the mission and I wanted to continue my work. And this just felt like a really unique opportunity to do that. So far, I really help the affiliates with whatever they would like to work on. And that's gone from helping one of the affiliates to submit a budget proposal to the county so they could receive county funding because they had expanded their territory. And that was a really interesting project because we really dug into, okay, what are the county needs? What have they stated? Where can NAMI be of service in that area? And how can we build on what they already have? So I really enjoyed that project. And sometimes we just brainstorm about how to get more people to show up to programming. Also, a large part of my work, which I think is part of advocacy in general, I think is fighting against this idea that we're all sort of on our own island and we're all a bit siloed. And when I started this position, I met with all the executive directors or affiliate leaders. Almost every single one of them just said that they are feeling like they don't really know the other affiliates around them. And I was just like, this is so silly. We're doing all the same exact work. They have so many resources they could be sharing with each other. So a lot of my work has been more of that relationship building of both with the affiliate leaders and myself and encouraging collaboration between them and remembering that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have a lot of great ideas that we're already having around. And if they can just talk to each other more, it's going to make everyone's life easier. And that's pivoted nicely with any advocacy work we do as well, because a lot of them have legislators that are in this overlapping territories. They can join together and approach them in the same meeting rather than continuing to meet separately. So, yeah, I mean, speaking to what Sierra said, I think sometimes in macro it's hard to see like the immediate impact of what you're doing. And this is true of clinical too, like so much is relationship building, and that's not necessarily going to be this tangible thing that you're going to see a result from every time, but it's also the most important thing I think about our work, like building trust, showing that you're going to do what you say you're going to do, and reminding people that they have all these resources around them. So I think when I was feeling a little bit like I don't see the impact of what we're doing, I tried to remember that we're building towards that just in all these little conversations we're having with people all the time and reminding them of their power and their voice. So that helped me a little bit. It's really hard to stay motivated right now, but remembering the core is these connections and you can be there for people in these small ways has really helped me get through it. But yeah, so that's a little bit about my work. It's still unfolding. It's a very recent position, but I've really enjoyed learning so much about Pennsylvania and learning about all these different areas and what kind of things they're trying to achieve. So thank you for inviting me.
No, thank you for that. Christine, do you mind sharing a little bit about your trajectory in social work in general? I
Yeah.
know I don't have like a traditional path to social work, and sometimes I like to share my story. I feel like most of you probably heard my story already. So I would love for someone else to share their trajectory, but would you mind just sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So I actually thought I was going to go into clinical psychology when I graduated from college. I worked at Temple as a clinical research assistant. I really liked it, but I found myself more than being interested in the research. I was more interested in how we're communicating the results of our studies to the people who are participating, because I think that's a huge gap and we're asking all these people very intimate details about their life, and then they may never be able, a lot of these articles are behind paywalls, and it's not very accessible language. So I just kept coming back to that, and I was like, okay, if this is like the core of what I'm thinking about, maybe I should look into social work because so much of that is about sharing resources and making sure people understand what they have access to. And I honestly didn't even know about macro social work before I started school. I was like, I knew a lot of social workers became therapists. I knew that wasn't the only option, but I thought it was more like case management. I thought all of it was more in the clinical realm. And then I remember talking to my advisor my first year, and everything I said that I was interested in, he was like, "It sounds like you want to do macro." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And then he just told me that you learn so much about organizing and policy and more of the day-to-day budgeting, grants, and that was just very appealing to me because I feel like I always come back to this wanting to address the bigger picture, and in hearing so many people's stories and working with people, you just see the patterns and you see how these are larger systems that need to shift in order to, if everyone's coming to you with the same issue, you can't treat that as a individual issue. Of course, you'll help people in the ways that you can, but that just doesn't seem like the only way to approach things. So I was really excited to have this other lens of social work that I could do. And yeah, I loved it. I was really glad that I went down that path. And I had a great supervisor at NAMI Chester, who's also a macro social worker. So I feel like I've been really lucky to hear about all the different paths that you can go down. And it's a very broad field. So I feel like that's exciting too, where you can really just follow what you're interested in.
No, thanks for sharing. I think sometimes when so I didn't know about macro social work. I mean, I knew about it when I was in grad school, but no one really explained macro social work, and what that means. And I'm thinking, like, are we looking for titles that says like macro social workers or like, like, is it the same thing as direct practice? And what I realize is that macro just means that we're in spaces that are not necessarily direct practice. And so and again, I would love to hear your sort of advice on this too, Christine. But when students come to me and they're like, I want to go in macro practice, but I don't even know where to start, I'm like, you have to just start looking at some positions. So a lot of the positions that we're going to find in some of these macro spaces are not going to be social workers, not going to be the title. And I want to remind you all, I feel like I've been talking about this the whole month of social work. But I want you to remind you all, social work is not a title. We are a profession. And so, what that means is that we are a social science, and that any space that you're in, you're always going to be a social worker. I say this when I step into spaces that I'm a social worker first and foremost, and these are my titles because I want them to know that I'm bringing that perspective as a social worker. I'm bringing that understanding of how systems play an impact on whatever we're talking about. I want them to know that that's the unique understanding that I'm bringing to that table. And so I want this to say to all of you on this call that when you are thinking about looking for jobs or new positions, I don't know where anyone is on their career path on this call, so I'm kind of making this as general as possible. But if you are someone who's looking into macro spaces, it's not necessarily the title, it's what is your passion? Actually, let's start there. If some of you would like to put in the chat, what are some of your passions? Because that's what drives me for this work is that I have a passion for problem solving. Just the way that my brain works. I am constantly someone who's thinking of scenarios, even scenarios that shouldn't be there. If this resonates with you, put your thumbs up. I feel like a lot of us are that type of individual. But my passion is problem solving. My passion is social work. My passion is Black women. I do a lot of my work is surrounded about how do I sort of help Black women in spaces and leadership. I take on mentor or mentees. I create groups, specific curated groups for Black women. I also am passionate about Black and Brown communities and other marginalized communities. And so my whenever I well, I'm kind of stuck. I'm in my job. I love my job, so I don't think I'll be leaving anytime soon. But whenever I'm thinking about if I were to move and what that next career path is going to be for me, as long as I'm fulfilling those passions, the job title doesn't necessarily matter. Then the next thing I look at is what are the skills that I have and what are some of the skills that I wanted to develop. When I came into this director role, I did not think I would be a project manager and program developer. It just came out of nowhere because I found that those skill sets are going to be valuable to not only my job that I'm doing now, but let's say the next position after this is in a C-suite position, or let's say it's running for office, or whatever that next position is. Those skills that I was able to develop in that job is going to help me with my next one. And so, really thinking about sort of your passions and your skill set, and not necessarily the job title, is really going to help you when you're thinking about sort of how do I move forward in my career. And always keep in mind that, again, social work is a profession. We have a code of ethics. We have competency based. We're a competency based profession. But we have curriculums. We have everything else that other professions have. And we just need to remind society that we are a profession and we're not just a job title. Um, let's see.
Yeah, the only other thing I would say is talk to as many macro social workers as you can because everyone's doing really unique and interesting work, and that might just get the wheels turning. Because, yeah, I just having my supervisor be a macro social worker, she told me some past jobs she'd had, and that was helpful to figure out what's possible. But I totally agree, thinking about like what fields, like I knew I wanted to be in the behavioral health fields, and that helped narrow things down, and then went from there.
Absolutely. And so we have one in the chat. Thank you for putting your passions. If others would like to put passions in there, I love seeing what some people are passionate about. All right, Joanna, sorry. I took a little bit.
Oh, no problem. No problem. Um, and this may be a good kind of transition to like our next segment, but uh, as macro social workers, I know something that I'm passionate about while we're to use that language is kind of thinking about that dichotomy, but or like really the false dichotomy between micro and macro social work that we split it out and we divide it and we like kind of split our education, and many social workers when they come into advocacy scenarios like this are going like, oh well, I don't have the skills because I'm not a macro social worker. So I was wondering if those of you who are macro social workers, President McNeil and Christine, if you could talk a little bit about and I'll add my perspective on at the end too, as I also am a macro social worker. But if you could talk a little bit about like how how the skills that you learned as a social worker apply to your macro work.
Okay, I can go first. So the one thing I love about social work is so much of what we learn is transferable. So I mentioned that most of my work is in project management. And so I convinced my job to send me to get my PMP, which is your project management professional. And so they were like, okay, as long as you are advocating for yourself and you can tie into what professional development that you have into your role, I think you will have a successful answer from your job. And so I was able to tie in why do I need this PMP and how gaining these skills is actually going to help my profession. Because PMP is very different from social work. Well, this is what I thought, but PMP is very different from social work. And so trying to convince them to send me to something that people usually get who work in tech or construction was a little bit of a challenge, but I was successful in that. And so they did send me to a training, and now I'm studying for the exam. And what I will tell you is that PNP is almost exactly like social work. Because what it does is that so first of all, the hardest part of me getting my PNP is the language because they'll create words that are essentially so different from what they're trying to communicate. So, for example, they'll talk about meeting people where they are and accessing people's skill set. And they call it like I members and team members. And they just have all this very challenging language. But as I'm actually doing project management, I realize I have all the skills as a social worker. So part of being a project manager is organization, right? And so as social workers, we know about organization, trying to keep track of our hours when doing supervision, trying to keep track of our cases when we're writing notes. We know how to sort of keep organizing. How to get a project from A to B. Again, we also know how to do a lot of that. When we're working with a client, if you're in direct practice or if you're macro practice, but speaking specifically for those who are in direct practice, when you're working with a client, you're not just going in there and be like, okay, let's just randomly start today's session. You are planning that out. That's what it means to get a project from point A to point B. You are going in there with a set plan and you are the leader of that group. And then you are giving individuals tasks based off of what you assess their skill set to be. And then because we know that when you give someone a task that aligns with their skill set, they're more likely to not only get that thing done, but they're more willing to give 100% to it. So, for example, giving me tedious tasks is not a good thing. It takes me forever to get my timesheets in. It takes me forever to get my reimbursements in because if I have to sit down and do something that requires me to scan documents and then list things out, I'm not good at that. And I will honestly admit that. But if you say, "Can you develop this program for me?" I will 100% do that. You have to give me just a little bit of information of what you want, and so I will be able to develop that. And so that's what PMP was teaching you, like, how do you access that? And so what I realize is that as I'm in a lot of these spaces, we think that social workers, we don't belong in these spaces because we don't have the skills. I will tell you right now, of all professions, those social workers have the proven track record to be at the table and not only be at the table, but to sort of influence some of those conversations. This will go back to my earlier my comment about sort of that unique ability or that unique understanding that we get about systems. There's a lot of times where I'm in spaces and they're talking about addressing, I'm going to use gun violence, they're talking about addressing gun violence. And yes, do we need harsher laws? Yes. Do we need a better way to track guns? All those things are true. The other part of that conversation should be, how about raising the minimum wage? Because we know that when people are able to have an income where they're able to create to be able to meet their basic needs, they're less likely to pick up a gun. How about we start addressing food insecurity, right? There's so many times where I'm in conversations and I hear people just talk about, oh, well, this 8-year old picked up a gun from like their family and then went to the store and to rob the store, and then you talk to the 8-year old, it's like, well, my mom was at work and I have younger siblings and they needed to eat and we had no food in there, right? So it's like if you start to think about problems from a different perspective, you begin to create solutions that actually work, and that is the benefit of being a social worker in these spaces. So don't ever let someone tell you that you don't belong in these spaces because you're a social worker. If anything, you absolutely belong there. You may not be the expert, but you have all the skills, and we have a proven track record as social workers to belong at that table and use our skill set to help influence policy, to help influence program development. So you belong there.
Yeah, so the only other thing I would say is I think a lot of what we do, and some programs actually have a mezzo track, which I really feel drawn to. We can't advocate on a macro level if we're not having those one-on-one personal conversations. And I think our training as social workers makes us extremely equipped to not only validate and hear what people are saying, but really understand what the things are that we can help them cope with on an individual level and what are things that are really out of their control. So I think as being trained as a social worker really helps me to succeed and just have better connections with people and really understand where they're coming from because often people are in such crisis that they don't even know what they need or what they're trying to ask for. So I think when you start back to that relationship building, when you're starting by just having a conversation and making sure people feel validated in the distress that they're experiencing, it takes you so far. And you can't do that if you're only thinking you're either a macro social worker, a micro social worker, or whatever. They all work together. Like you need the people skills in order to make these larger changes. And if you're working in a clinical field, you have such a wealth of knowledge of what people are experiencing day to day. And that is so important to bring to this macro level. And those are the people who are going to have the expertise and helping us understand what is going on each day and what people are struggling with the most. So, yeah, I wish it wasn't so they really do try to like separate it out and I do feel frustrated by that sometimes because I think it all works together. You can't do anything without the other.
Christine, you just mentioned a couple of things that I would have that that I'll talk about a little bit as well. One of them is that building relationships aspect. Social workers are incredibly good at building relationships. I mean, that's like practically our core skill. We're not going to be able to work with a client if we're not, building the relationship with that client. Not going to be able to work with a group if we're not doing, if we're not building relationship with the group, and we're not going to be able to make a difference at the macro level either if we're not building those relationships. Those skills apply. Matter of fact, one of the I think it was an actual study of uh, legislative staff, et cetera, that were given, the some surveys about like, well, what, describe effective advocates. And two of the biggest words that came up were like relational and persistence. Both of those things being incredibly important in areas where social workers excel. So, knowing that those skills transfer, that the exact same skills that you would use to build a relationship with a client are the same ones that you would use to build a relationship with an organization that you want to work with at the macro level, or your state legislator, or local county commissioner or school board representative. You just need to be in the mindset of like applying those skills to what you're doing. But they all transfer and they all apply, just like President McNeil was talking about earlier. Those skills are highly transferable. The other thing that Christine, that you mentioned, that I wanted to highlight, that really goes into what I was planning to say as well, is that those stories, that those people who work it at the micro level, like part of what you're building, part of what you're getting out of that is that you now have, you can speak to the direct relational impact of what of what is happening with policy and legislation. It's I'll use an example of something that came up in my practice. Obviously my work is that I've worked with NASW for my career, and in a variety of different capacities with different states, different chapters, et cetera. But one constant throughout all of it is that I've always been very involved in the advocacy and government relations part of it. And there have been many circumstances where, like, you're talking to an elected official and you're talking to them about, talking points and statistics, research, data, etc. And you can have a good and effective conversation. But what really makes the difference is when they're hearing like, oh, well, this is like, even when I've been talking about the social work compact, I've been using an example of like, a social worker contacted me at my office and had a client who was moving to Pennsylvania, and they're trying to figure out whether they can, continue seeing their client, who has a right to continuity of care, but there wouldn't be able to do so unless they got licensed in Pennsylvania, and how the compact would address that if the compact was in place in both of the states. But just bringing it down to that like specific personal level, all of our elected officials, our lobbyists, our whether it be at the city, state, federal level, they're all people, and they all kind of respond more directly at an emotional level to the situation of the individual than they do of the situation of the bulk. Like, if we're talking about facts, statistics, etc., that does, even if it's relevant, even if it's even if it is hurtful to hundreds, thousands of people, talking about it at that level is still not going to have the same emotional impact of talking about the one. And if you're working at the clinical level or the micro level, and you're, one of the big tools that you're bringing with you is that you can take those stories, without breaking confidentiality, of course, usually without even bringing names into it, but you can tell those stories about how the policy that you're talking about impacts a specific person, or the individual, and that can be incredibly powerful. And if you don't have those, then you may have the ability to relate stories that you've heard, like I'm not the social worker who's trying to move from or who has a client that's moving from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania. I'm the one who heard about it and was giving advice to that person. So we can bring in those individual stories as well.
Yeah, so I know we haven't done much of this throughout some of these sessions, but I really would love to hear from some of you that are attending. I hope you don't sign off. Don't sign off. I want you to stay on, because I know sometimes when we ask for participation, people start logging off. But I do want to take this opportunity to answer any questions that you may all have about macro social work, advocacy, anything that may be pressing your mind, because I realized that when I was a student, not many people, or there weren't many opportunities to ask questions around macro practice. And so I want to just see and touch base with the audience. Are there any specific questions? Even if you don't want to come off, if you could just put it in the chat, but I would love to sort of hear from some of you. Never have I been in a room with quiet social workers. Yes, thanks, Tim. Don't be shy.
Well, while we're waiting, or if folks want to type their questions, any questions or comments in the chat, one thing I did want to mention, actually, Tim, if you're on the call, you mentioned to me earlier this morning about another opportunity to talk, like maybe in a more comfortable setting. Tim, do you want to come off mute and talk about that for a second?
Mm. Hello.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, students talking with students that have been there before, students that haven't been there before, Monday night, if it got approved, she mentioned it, 7 o'clock, do a Zoom just like this. And then you can, say where you're from, what school you're at, how the vibe at the school is, with how you're excited about Advocacy Day or not, and any concerns or just nervousness, it's just student to student chatter back and forth, two-way conversation kind of thing. Then just like the president mentioned, hey, any questions by all means. The floor has pretty much been open all week, even though we have had some amazing speakers come and whatnot. But we're in this together, and hopefully for the long haul, you guys, when you can learn more about what the association does for the industry and does for social workers. I've learned a lot. I didn't know, and any license, we need to have a strong association behind us, to lobby for the things that we need. So, we might even have a surprise guest, but I'm not sure. I reached out. Hey, I'm just gonna make it public, you guys. I did a YouTube video. I reached out to Lieutenant Governor, um, and just because he's really big about, supporting the communities and stuff, and she said, "Hey, you want to pop in for 5 minutes?" How would that not enhance our confidence coming into to lead date? Extremely busy gentleman, and he has a family, so and it was the last minute, but I went ahead and threw it out there, and so I'm looking forward to learn more about you guys. I'm an intern and I'm a student, and we can just meet face to face on that level.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that was Tim is one of our interns with NASW-PA, and our set of four interns, I believe, are like or decided to host, yeah, all of whom are in the office right now, stuffing bags. But decided to host an impromptu Zoom meeting that students are welcome to join, so that you can talk more on a student to student level in a way that you might not otherwise feel comfortable with if you're addressing your question, to the executive director or to our chapter president, although we're we're open to your questions as well. I did see one of the questions come in, and it was, how do you suggest making the transition if you're in like a micro setting, micro or mezzo setting, to something a bit more macro in your profession?
Yeah, so funny part is I actually went to school to be a clinician. So when I was in graduate school, I was like, oh, I'm gonna get certified in TFCBT or DBT. I didn't know which one. But that's sort of what I wanted to do. And so 2 months before graduation, I realized I did not want to be a therapist. And I was like, so I just spent this money. I also at the time am still very new to social work. I knew nothing really about social work except for what I learned in graduate school. And so my family was even like, so what are you doing? Like you just spent all this money. None of us really know what social work is, and now you're saying you don't want to be a therapist. What are you going to do with your life? And I was like, that is a great question. And so moving into macro spaces was a lot easier than I anticipated. And the first thing is going back to our education as social workers. We have the ability to get sort of both of those educations at one time, especially in now, I do not have my BSW, so I don't know what the BSW programs look like, but as someone who went through their master's program full time, my experience was the first sort of year was sort of an education of both. So we got some clinical courses, and then we also got some macro courses. And then in your advanced year, that's where you sort of pick that track. So I had the opportunity to take more macro classes. Yes, who would have thought I would have took more classes in grad school? But I got a scholarship, and so I was like, oh well, if you're paying for it, why not take these opportunities? And so I did take some macro courses. I think I took like a grant writing course. I took something on like community organizing. And so that's also what kind of started my interest in macro practice. So what do I do, right? So I went to school to be a clinician. Both of my internships was in clinical. What I did is I just advocated why I having this clinical background would be helpful for macro spaces. And I think that's why connecting the dots that we as social workers, we're multifaceted. It doesn't matter if you go to school for clinical, like when you get your degree, it doesn't say a clinical master's of social work, it says master's of social work, right? And so we all get the same degree. And so the transition, we're overthinking it. I'm telling you right now, if there's something I've learned over the past 4 years of being the president, is that social workers, we overthink things and we make them way too complicated. You all have the skills to do that. I think sometimes getting creative with how your resume looks like. I teach students how to not cater, but sort of gear their resume towards whatever position that they're applying for, but also cover letters. I know I hate writing cover letters. I do not enjoy writing cover letters. But if you are someone who's more in that micro mezzo space and you're looking to get more into those macro spaces, that cover letter is how you're going to sell yourself. You are going to take your roles that you are currently doing and then explain how those roles will help you in your new position. So that's like going and looking at what are some of the day-to-day responsibilities and then taking what you have been able to accomplish over the course of your career or the course of your career, and then translate those in your cover letters of why you'll be able to sort of achieve that. I mean, I know that I'm making it sound very simple, but that's honestly where you start because there's really no wrong or right way to get into these spaces. But it's again just remembering that you already have those skill sets. It's just how do I now let everyone else know that I have it? And so making sure that your resume matches up with, and that's talking about recategorizing how you put some jobs in. So most of my work has been in macro spaces, so that's at the top. However, I still have my clinical experience from CHOP and my other internship on there because some, if let's say for I was applying for this position, I need them to know that I still have a clinical background. I need them to know that I understand that. Being the director of workforce development, I need to know what you're facing as clinicians. And I did understand that when I was a student because I was going into the workforce, and part of why I transitioned to macros because of the pay is better. And so I do under sort of grasp that. Part of being a social worker is that, listen, I may not be a clinician, but I know how to reach out and organize clinicians to give me the information that I need to do my job better. So again, don't overthink it. Social workers, you have all the skills that you need. It's just finding a way to communicate that to whatever job or person that you're talking to.
I will echo that 100%. I was also going to mention cover letters, especially based on that follow-up question that came in about like that other professions and other spaces don't always recognize the value of social work and how transferable those social work skills are. Um, I know folks who have experienced that. I've like had those conversations about how like, and it can be difficult, to break in, like if you're, like if you're going into like a political job and you're going against people who have like law degrees or, or political science degrees, et cetera, to be able to say like, and the people that are hiring you don't know, aren't familiar with social work. But yes, exactly. Those cover letters are the opportunity to be like, I I'm a social worker. My degree in social work gives me skills in, in kind of spelling out some of that and just accepting that part of the role of what you're doing in that cover letter, if you have that degree in social work, is explaining what social work is and what a degree in social work actually means. So definitely utilize those, and like President McNeil said about being like creative with your, with your descriptions, and making sure that you're tailoring it to the job that you're applying for. All right. Any closing thoughts from any of our panelists?
I hope to see you all at LEAD.
Very true, very true. Yeah, hopefully you've already registered for LEAD. If you're planning on coming, that is an important part of it. Make sure that we have like packets and materials available for you. Our team is busy stuffing some of those packets like right now. But registration officially closes on Sunday, which is our last opportunity to like get those registrations in. This recording, along with all of the recording from our past webinars, are all posted on YouTube. They're public, so they are searchable, but they also are on the LEAD attendee website, which you should have access to if you're registered for LEAD. That also has, appointment lists, etc. One thing now that we've posted those appointments, that we're encountering is some people saying like, oh, well, I can't make that appointment because it's too late or too early or whatever. Though that is important information for us to know, especially if your entire school is not able to attend, so that we can make alternate accommodations and reschedule wherever possible. So that is something to keep an eye out for. Other than that, like I said, we'll make sure that we have one final email going out to all of the lead participants, and we will make sure that it includes the information about that final Zoom that our interns are hosting Monday evening. But the link will be the same. So just utilize the same Zoom connection, and that will get you into the session. All right, but yeah, absolutely. We look forward to seeing everybody Tuesday morning we'll be ready for check-in at 10 a.m. at City Island. Thank you so much.